Alright, this is the first of the four for Tuesday, and we're going to pick up with a little bit more about the Civilian Conservation Corps and the other programs that were part of the New Deal. Civilian Conservation Corps, which we talked about in class last time, was a program that was designed to take young men out of the cities, put them to work, for the most part run by those few officers and generals and officials who were still left in the U.S. military, which was downsized dramatically during the Depression. But again, it took them out, had them do some work, and was actually seen by many of the people that were in it as something that was very positive. Again, the whole idea behind a lot of the first New Deal, as it was called, was to convince people that things could be better, and the CCC is probably a great example of that idea and how it would work when it was successful. The next program we'll talk about is the WPA, or Works Progress Administration, and that particular program was somewhat similar in that it was involved in what were called make-work projects, and that means that they were actually hired to do a lot of things that may or may not have been needed at the time, and again, the government would spend more money than it had in order to put people to work, and this is all over the country. They did turn this to the states to some extent and give them the money and say, come up with something to do. So WPA projects were everything from the Mount Rushmore that we talked about before to, for instance, in Texas, they built everything from sidewalks to most of the courthouses that you'll find that are similar to each other in most of the counties in Texas were built by the WPA. Bridges, roads, different things that may or may not have been needed, all the way to some of those historical markers that you pass by at 90 miles an hour and don't stop and look at throughout Texas were also built by the WPA. So again, the idea being put people to work. It didn't keep them employed for a long period of time, but long enough so that they would get some money, feel a little bit more positive about themselves, and hopefully kickstart the economy. Another example, and we're going to see it on the next slide, was a TVA, and we'll get to that in a minute. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. I usually tell this story about the country during the initial part of the New Deal, or the first New Deal. The United States was a little bit like a patient in a hospital bed. When you go to the hospital and you have a friend or a relative who's there, and you go there right after whatever it was that put them in the hospital, usually they're not feeling very well, and they're not really commenting too much to you, or if they are, it's not the usual person that you're used to. But then later, when you come back, say a few days later, if it's something that's very severe, or something that takes a lot more time, you come back and they're complaining about the food and the nurses and how things are boring and there's nothing on TV and so forth. And what you know then is that they're actually getting better. Well, one of the things that was interesting about the first stages of the New Deal was this attitude change that we talked about, that even the Republicans had to admit occurred. And it really changed because people said, look, someone is now in charge, and they're actually not only in charge, but they seem to be doing something. Now, the true results will take time, and as you see here on the slide, the basic depression continues, and in fact will only be alleviated by World War II, when we have over 100% employment, and that's because women will actually join the workforce in World War II, because we need more than just the male workers can actually produce, many of whom are in the war. But the idea is that what the New Deal did, and this is the bottom line on it, was that it actually stopped the downward slide of the economy. And as I was mentioning when we left it last time, that's the first step, because an economy takes a long time to turn around, and without stopping that downward slide, things could have truly gone down the tubes and the country could have totally collapsed. But the basic depression does continue, as we'll talk about. A couple of other things. We talked about Mount Rushmore being built as a WPA program. One of the more successful WPA programs, or at least a program that was similar to it had its own name and its own acronym, was the Tennessee Valley Authority. And if there's anything that is a prototype for a New Deal program that was successful, it would be this one. it took a problem, and the problem was that the rivers that you see here in this map flooded quite often and really devastated the land and the people around them. And secondly, a lot of the people in those areas had no electricity because there just had not been electrified yet. And thirdly, of course, these people were all unemployed and suffering through the Depression. So the U.S. government came in, hired many of the people that lived in the area. Now, it's also true that they took away the land that belonged to some of the people in the area as well, which made them rather angry. But as you can see in this map, they built a whole series of hydroelectric dams. And they paid many people to be involved in it, and of course they use that money. The people that are paid go out and buy new things, and it helps to kickstart the economy. But beyond that, it controls the flooding and then also provides electricity for the people in that entire area. TVA was so successful in producing hydroelectric power, jobs, and flood control that it existed for a long time after the Depression had ended. Some of these programs do take a while to get rid of or to be seen as totally being finished, but this is one that was truly a success story for the New Deal, and one that is very easy to point to when you're looking at something that actually worked. On the other hand, we had the Dust Bowl, and unfortunately, along with the Depression for the farmers in the Midwest and the areas you see here, there was severe drought, and of course, the other problem was that with the drought, the land was very dry, and there were also bad farming practices that were followed by many of these farmers, all of whom were individual business people and tried to have their own homestead and land, but ultimately, as you can see on the left, with the giant dust storms that occurred, what they called this was the Dust Bowl. And many of the people who lived in the Midwest had to pick up and go look for some other place to try and be successful. Now, many had heard about the wonderful weather and all the farm areas in California and believed that they could go there to, in essence, another land of milk and honey. The first group to take off and just really leave their land and put everything they owned in any vehicle or anything they could get to the west were people from western Oklahoma, that area you see there in pink where the drought is really bad. And so when they arrived, and all the Midwesterners who followed them arrived, they were given the same basic nickname, which was Okies, being from Oklahoma. Many of whom took Route 66, which was not an interstate because those didn't exist yet, but it was a series of state highways that really led from Chicago, as you see there, all the way to California. The plight of these workers and the terrible situation they went into when they got to California was explained very well in a later book and movie and play called The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. And he talked about how when the people got out there, they were mistreated, there were no jobs for them, their idea that they could go there and make a living for themselves was actually wrong, and they were treated, they just had a really tough time of it. In fact, many of them actually picked up and came back, but a lot did stay out there and actually increase the population of California. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about a tax on the New Deal, and it's interesting because, as I said before, nobody really complained that much about it initially. It's like the patient in the hospital who was ill. But then once people, the country began to have more success, we returned to our old political ways, and you saw really two different groups attacking the New Deal. And again, the fact that they were attacking and complaining about it showed that it was actually turning the country around. We could go back to somewhat normal politics, at least to some extent. And the attacks really came from two different perspectives. The left, which included Democrats and then a lot of people who wanted to go further into socialism and maybe even to communism, argued that Roosevelt had an opportunity here to really change the country, and that he was not doing it quickly enough or with enough vigor to truly change things and take care of the common man. And so the left argues that the New Deal doesn't go far enough. They have a great opportunity, and there's many other things that need to be addressed besides just the programs that were passed. The right, of course, mainly Republicans, argued that it went too far. Now, what's interesting is that Roosevelt himself was sort of stuck in the middle of all of this. He knew he had to fix the country. He wanted to fix the country. He wanted to help the common people. On the other hand, he was truly fearful that if the government got too involved and began to give away too much to the American people, that people would get hooked on this and would really just believe the government should take care of them from this point forward. And that was not truly his view. He saw what the New Deal was turning into, or what it should be, as an emergency action. And then, although it needed to make some changes, he didn't really think that massive change needed to occur. So let's take a look at what the two sides argued needed to be done. The left wanted more socialism. They wanted more income equality. They wanted to raise taxes on the wealthy, of course blaming them for the mess of the Depression itself. They definitely wanted more social programs, and this group included socialists, liberal Democrats, and they actually advocated confiscating the wealth from the rich and giving it to the masses in some cases. Now on the right, there was the fear of people getting used to handouts, the dole. Their argument was that the New Deal and the regulations it put on business and forcing them to deal with labor unions and take care of the common man stifled growth that could occur. Of course, taxes would keep people from being able to invest, according to the old trickle-down theory. And they argued that a lot of the spending was wasteful. Things like carving faces into mountains and recording people and stuff like that sounded very wasteful. And, of course, that was mainly the Republicans. However, on the left, there were three major antagonists who truly had an impact on Roosevelt, and in fact have an impact on your life today. At least one of them definitely does. The first one is a really crazy, I'm just going to say it that way, political figure from the state of Louisiana. This is a man by the name of Huey P. Long, who is a very popular politician from Louisiana, comes up from the lower levels of society. He is educated, but he's also somebody who understood what the common man was dealing with, and was very popular in Louisiana because he took care of a lot of people. Now, he did so sometimes through corruption, sometimes through forcing his will on people, but he had provided social programs for people in Louisiana from the state while he was governor. Now, it was interesting. So how could he do this if there was no tax money coming in? Well, he just raised taxes on the wealthy, saying that had to happen. And specifically, he was able to get a lot of tax money out of the oil companies that were in Louisiana at the time. Now, Long was quite a character, very corrupt, but also very dynamic and charismatic. In fact, at one point, he's not only the governor of Louisiana, but he's also the senator in the United States Senate from Louisiana, which most states say is illegal, but Louisiana is always a little bit different than other states. But as the New Deal seemed to be having some success, he began to campaign on the idea that Roosevelt wasn't going far enough, and that the federal government needed to do a lot of the things that he had been doing in the state of Louisiana. And his theory was that every man could be a king. So this is socialism at best, and maybe even a hint of communism to some extent. Now, his pushing about how Roosevelt needed to go further left was important, but he is actually assassinated in 1935 by somebody who was very angry with something he had done politically, and you can still see the bullet holes in the walls in the Capitol building in Baton Rouge. But Long was a man who he was a very charismatic figure, but he did push Roosevelt to the left. Now, the next guy we're going to talk about is Father Coughlin, the radio priest. So those of you who think only the Protestants use the airways are very wrong. And he pushes very hard up north for socialism and for the government to take care of people. In some ways, his ideas matched Huey Long's, although in a very different direction, and or at least a different method of saying basically the same thing. The one thing about Coughlin that is really dwelled upon today was that he was pretty much a racist, which people usually fall back on. But the truth is that at the time, although racism was not overly popular, it was not something that guaranteed that people wouldn't listen to you. So when he pushed the idea that the government needed to do more, a lot of people in the North, especially Catholics, since he was a priest, and in the middle class, believed that Roosevelt had not gone far enough. Now, the third guy is a guy who's really important to you today and continues to be important to you, me, and anyone who gets a paycheck in the United States. His name is Dr. Charles Townsend, and we will pick up with him